Thank you, Professor Perellis. Good afternoon. I recognize as the professor, thank you, Rabbi Fine, very much for the welcome and for arranging the opportunity for me to share some Divrei Torah with you. And I respect tremendously that your time is precious and that you are voluntarily here to be able to hear some thoughts and to share before Hanukkah. Being that Hanukkah is Sunday night, I thought that we might speak a bit about that and have a look at a particular perspective regarding Hanukkah, and that is the way that Hanukkah manifests around our covenant, around our brit with God. But before we get there, a bit about brit, a bit about covenant. I want to think with you a bit on what it is that it means, what kind of place that it has in terms of our people, and how that relates to Hanukkah specifically, and the story of Hanukkah. So the first thing is this idea of covenant, right? This idea that God engages in covenant with his world. It is an idea that is extremely prevalent in our Torah. God has multiple covenants. Who can tell me one covenant besides the one that he has with Abraham? Anybody know another covenant that God enters into? Yes. So that's with Noah and the rest of the world, that he's not going to destroy the world through flood. There's a little asterisk in that contract, right? Not with flood, but maybe leaves other options open. Yes. Say again. Matan Torah. There's a covenant that's established specifically there with the people, right, as opposed to Avraham Avinu. So there's a development of covenant over there. There is covenant all out. There are micro covenants. There's covenant with David. There's covenant with Aharon and his children. Covenant with Pinchas. Yeah. So there's an interesting issue here that God of the Jewish Bible, our God, has a propensity to covenant. If you look in other religious texts, you look in the New Testament, you look in the Quran, not saying that you need to or you have to, but if you were to, and I speak in my interfaith work, which is part of my job, I speak to the imams and I speak to the priests and scholars, Christian scholars, and I talk to them and I say, well, how does covenant run in your texts? I was speaking to an imam friend of mine just last week, and I said, tell me about covenant in the Quran. And he said, well, it speaks about covenant. It speaks about the covenant of God with Israel and what it is that our relationship is to that. Testament is not covenant. Covenant is very much a signifying factor of the Jewish Bible. And I want to think about what it is that means, because when we talk about God, and we think about God as we tend to recognize him, omnipotent is definitely something that we would say about him, right? Meaning that he's all-powerful. If God is not completely and utterly sovereign and free, who is? It's one of the things that we recognize applies to God, yeah? Well, that means that God can do whatever it is that God wishes to do. There is nothing holding him. There is nothing stopping him. And that also means that God does not run by rules, doesn't it? He doesn't have to do anything, follow anything. If he did, then the rules would be God, because they would govern him, as opposed to the other way around. So consider what covenant means. Covenant, when God is involved, means that God is committing to running by rules. He is confining himself. He is saying, I choose. I'm using my freedom as God, and I am choosing to bind myself, so to speak, to this particular agreement. I will run by the rules of this agreement. So as you said before, with Noah, he's saying to Noah, you know what? I usually don't like to do this. I don't run by rules. But now I am going to commit to all of humankind. I'm not going to destroy the world by flood anymore. You can take it to the bank. Now, also being God, we expect that if he promises something, the promise is ironclad. He doesn't go back on what it is that he commits to and promises to. You can take it to the bank. Before that, though, Chazal recognized, for example, and you might have heard this before, Chazal say, well, what was God doing before he created our world? It says that he was borei olamot u'macharivan. He created worlds and destroyed them. There was nothing at all that required him or that prompted him to hold them, which is a peculiar thing, but nonetheless, he's utterly free. Nothing governs him. He does what he wishes in his creative capacities. So he doodles and scraps and doodles and scraps. Even the one that we're on, right, as far as the Torah is concerned, came this close to being wiped out. You cannot get through the first parasha of Bereshit in the Torah until the entire project crashes and burns. Isn't that right? It opens so beautifully, Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim et haaretz, and you read about all of this beautiful thing. By the end of the parasha, he doesn't like it. The whole thing's running amok. He wants to destroy it. So this is a very interesting thing. There is a lack, what it implies, right? What we recognize is God as God, without covenant, is a very unstable, unpredictable entity. You have no idea where it is that he's going, what is it he's going to do, nor does he need to. Just because he did one thing yesterday does not mean that he has to do the same thing tomorrow. And he reserves that right because he's God. It makes perfect sense. It's not comfortable for us to think of, but it makes perfect sense. But there is this peculiarity. In our Torah, HaKadosh Baruch Hu has a propensity to covenant, which means not once, not twice, but several times in the Torah, he expresses his willingness to bind himself for the sake of relationship with his creations. One of the most significant that is meaningful to us as Jews is this covenant that the Torah says he entered into with Avraham Avinu, seemingly for no apparent reason. I'd love to unpack that more for you, but I'm conscious of time. I'm simply throwing it out there. At least as far as the script, as the verse, as the written text is concerned, there's no particular reason why HaKadosh Baruch Hu decides Avraham is going to be the one. Michael Wishegrod, have you heard of Michael Wishegrod? You should look him up. He's worth reading. Michael Wishegrod suggests that God falls in love with Avraham Avinu. Falls in love? What kind of God falls in love? Well, one could say that in general. What kind of God loves? I mean, if you're talking about a God that is beyond all things, can we talk about emotions and so on for him, or with him, or applying to him? If you were to ask the Rambam, he would say, well, you can, but you have to know that when you say it, you're not meaning what you say. So when we say that God loves, we are saying that God does not love. But he doesn't love in any way that you know. All right, well, that's already, I don't know what to do with that. But nonetheless, if we take Torah at its surface, at its face value, if we look at Torah in the way that it speaks to us, God loves. God loves, God embraces, God pays attention, God cares. And if he loves, which is very much a human kind of thing, which perhaps humans draw from him, he can fall in love. And for some reason it is Avraham Avinu in the text that he finds and falls in love with. I don't know if you've ever fallen in love. You don't have to tell me. I'm not asking you. But you know, if you know, that it's very difficult to give reasons for why it is that it happens. It's complex. It's beyond any particular measure. It simply occurs, it emerges, it manifests, and there it is. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu enters into covenant with Avraham Avinu. And what that means is that God says to Avraham, Avraham, I am dedicating myself to confining my freedoms, to restricting my liberty as the ultimate sovereign, to be in relationship with you and your family. And that's what happens. Now you listen to that and think, well, what kind of an odd thing? Why would God do that? I'm not here to answer that with you today. Again, because I'm concerned about time. But I encourage you to think on that. What I will say, however, is that we would not be sitting here at YU, Stern, Barron Campus, Koch Auditorium as Jewish students almost 4,000 years later if there was not something to that. Because we shouldn't be here. That's the truth. We take that for granted. We should not be here, especially given our history, when at every turn we have been the object of hatred, persecution, and destruction, burned by the fires of the world, away from home. There is something to be said about this mysterious relationship that God has with the family of Avraham Avinu, which we are, all of us. And so God dedicates himself to this. And that's something I'd like to pause on a bit. That I would like to pause on. The family of Avraham. Because if we look at the covenant, if we look at the Brit of Avraham, and even the Brit that is later established at Sinai, which is on top of the Brit of Avraham Avinu, as the Rambam says at the end of Hilchot Avodah Zarah, u'me'ahavat Hashem otanu, u'mishvuato shenishba le'Avraham Avinu, because God loved us and swore to Avraham Avinu, asa Moshe Rabbeinu, he made Moshe and sent him to teach us how it is that we can connect with him. Derech avodato, he says. So this covenant is established with Abraham's family. And what do I want to focus on here? It is ostensibly an odd basis to establish covenant. Because the chances are, if you were to ask a general Jew, even a general Gentile on the street, whether God was interested first in terms of family or first in terms of philosophy, the likelihood is that philosophy would be the first choice. God, in other words, God liked Abraham's thought. God liked what Abraham was thinking, the way that he was approaching life, his credo for living. But it's not what God chooses. He doesn't say, Abraham, I am going to lock myself into covenant with you and all of your students, which to Abraham would have been more acceptable. Because Abraham was interested in university, in the truest sense of the word. He wanted to open it to all beings, to have a universal teaching of this. He went all over the place to teach what it was that he knew. And here HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, yes, Abraham, you and your family. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu is primarily choosing not the philosophy of Abraham, not even the religious sensibility of Abraham, but the man, the human, the being that is Abraham. And that God sees in his family, in the faces of his children and grandchildren, the original love that he had for Abraham. And imagine it. You can relate to this. Because imagine if there was somebody that you loved very deeply, and you had a deep bond to that individual, on whatever level. And all of a sudden you were out at a playground and you saw a bunch of kids playing, random kids, you don't know these kids, right? You're just watching the kids playing, and somebody's standing next to you, he says, remember, you know that person that you love, you know this, see that little girl over there? That's his or her granddaughter. What immediately would happen to that child in your mind amongst all the other kids, right? Oh, that really? Let me see. Let me go talk to her. See what she, yeah. Well, that's what this is. Strange, perhaps, but again, the strangeness of it, I decide not to deal with today. Not that I won't want to. We can do it again if you like next time. We'll talk about the strangeness of it. But for today's purposes, for now, let's let the strangeness be and recognize that this is part of the reality of how it is that it's presented in Torah. And that if we are sitting here today as Jewish people, it is because of our family. that we are members of this national family, and that there is a bond between all of us because of that. No matter how far we might be related, there is something unique about our people in that we know that we are members of an extended family. I believe, and this is entirely empirical, I confess that from the beginning. But if you spend time in Israel, for example, even if you live there perhaps for a long period of time or for any, you recognize that this country, it's not like other countries. There is something about the people who live there, even when they are at the strongest odds with each other. It's a family arguing with each other. It's members of a family that are just upset with other members of the family about how it is that they're living. But that's the feeling of it. Now I'll tell you something. I mean, I interact with a lot of non-Jews, and I was actually in a conference that was over several days. And I had one other Jewish person that was with me in the conference, and everybody else was not Jewish. And this person was sharing that their child, unfortunately, was not well. Thank God their child is okay now, but their child was not well. And he was just sharing that, he mentioned this in his synagogue, and the whole synagogue is praying, and the synagogue sent messages to people out there, to pray for this child. And I'm listening to this, and it's very matter of fact for me. I'm very used to hearing that. You hear another Jewish person is sick. Here, can you pray for this name of this person? That's not something that all of us are familiar with, right? And I'm realizing that for everybody else in that room, it was the strangest of things. And they actually told me. They said, "You pray for each other like that? Do you know? Like who? Does everybody?" No, they have no idea who his son is. But that's something that we take for granted, that we don't recognize is a manifestation of the fact that we are a national family. That outside, that doesn't happen amongst Christians of the world. They may pray for the plight of Christians in other regions of the world in general, but you don't say, "Here, can you please pray for this individual person?" This other. That's very rare. That to us, ubiquitous. And that is a manifestation of the fact that that is who we are. And it is something that I wish to call to your attention today, because it's something that is so much in the water that we don't even recognize that it's there, because we take it for granted. We take for granted that we are all bonded, and therefore we can play around with that and be tough to each other and criticize each other, not talk to each other, whatever it be, because we know that at the end of the day we're in this all together, and that God forbid, and I will say this, but God forbid that if there was a Hitler, God forbid, that were to look at us, he would make no such differentiations as we do internally. It would be one thing: you're all members of one family. So that is at the core of who we are and what we are about. Everything else, everything else, the religious ideas, the philosophical ideas, the ethical ideas, the moral ideas. Judaism is not, the Jewish people, I shouldn't say Judaism, scratch that. The Jewish people, the people of Israel, are not first and foremost a religion, are not first and foremost an ideology, are not first and foremost an ethical and moral society. We are first and foremost a family, a people. And the covenant is with every one of you in your person, as it was with our great-grandfather. And on top of that, very important parts of our family are our religious ideas, our philosophical concepts, our ideologies, our ethics, and our morals. Those are overlays, but they are not the foundation stone. What does all of this have to do with Hanukkah? I think it has a great deal to do with Hanukkah. Because Hanukkah historically was the first real time, the real first time in which swaths, huge portions of the Jewish people were fundamentally questioning whether being part of the Jewish people was still worthwhile, or should they defect and simply become Greek. I'll explain what I mean, right? Throughout all of the Nevi'im, for example, right? Throughout all of the books of the prophets, we have issues with Avodah Zarah. right? So, I mean, any cursory reading, right, of this, you realize that the theme that constantly recurs, that this is God's big issue. Throughout most of the Nevi'im, the major issue is one of two things. A, you keep looking at other gods, and I'm jealous. And I'm not going to take it anymore. Please stop. Okay, we stop. And we go back to it. Please stop. Okay, we go back to it. That's what goes on over and over again. And the other is that we do not fight for the ger, the atom, the almanah. We become very centrally focused, selfish. We're not interested in the rest of the family. We don't take care of everybody else. We're only interested in our own dealings. That's, for all intents and purposes, what goes on. You rarely, if ever, see, right? When I say rarely, if ever, I mean never. You never see God saying, why aren't you putting on tefillin? You've got to do that. Stop with the no tzitzit, you know? I don't like the way that the women are dressing. That doesn't manifest anywhere in the Nevi'im. Sprinkled in there is a Shabbat here and there, but remember that Shabbat is Oti beni uben bnei Israel. It's a sign between me and Israel about my covenant, right? It's the partnership. All that happens during the Nevi'im is that we dabble in other things. We never consider that we are going to leave our commitment to God. We try to keep both, right? Because we like going over there a little while every now and then and playing in everybody else's backyard. But we never consider, you know something, this is not for us anymore. Certainly not en masse. But when it comes to our interaction with the Greeks, that was a serious issue for us. And one of the major reasons for that is because until the Greeks, we never really experienced a nation of people that rivaled us the way that they did. Because here all of a sudden you have a people who are actually asking questions that were very similar to the questions that we were asking ourselves. What is the good life? How should one lead the best life? What does it mean to examine one's life? To consider what the nature of life is? And if you go back to the earlier philosophers in Greece, like Parmenides and Heraclitus, they're asking deeper, more fundamental questions. They're asking, what is the nature of existence? What is the condition of being? Who's asking those questions before these people? Nobody, except us. In different ways, but us. And so imagine what it is to be able to bump into a nation that are raising these sophisticated questions that till this day we are dealing with in very real terms. And they don't even have a Torah. They just did it on their own. They came up with this stuff. And they're more fun than we are. They've got sports. Right? They're dressing a little bit more provocatively and revealing than we are. They seem to be having more fun. What do we need this for? So the story of Hanukkah is, number one, an issue of an internal identity crisis. Who are we and what should we be? And why should we not all become Greek? Big question. And it's also about what about us is worth fighting for, if at all. And what it ends up being is a fight for our identity. And that's as deep as it gets. It's not just our religion, which is often portrayed, right? We want to have our religion back. Well, why? Why do we want to have our religion back? Not because it is the right religion, although that's true as far as they're concerned, right? As far as they thought that was true, but that wasn't what was propelling this. It's because it's who we are. This is a question of our identity. It's a question of who we are on this planet. What does it mean to be us? And the truth is, there was a small group of Jewish people who thought, you know something, enough is enough, we have to fight this. And that was the family of the Kohen Gadol, Bet Hashmonai. They decided to risk everything and fight for who they were, even if it meant dying in the process. But they were not going to risk their own lives and their own identity and their own names and dissipate and completely assimilate into the great power that was running at the time, that was Greece. They decided to fight for who they were. Crazy, they won. It was a nuts thing. I mean, nobody expected it. They were ready to die. But they were willing to die on the battlefield fighting for their own identity and for who they were, than to completely lose what it meant to be them. So they win that battle. Short-lived, doesn't last for a very long time, a couple centuries and a half. But they win, and what it is that they win is their individuality, their independence, and their identity back. That's what they fight for, and that's what they get. And that's why beautifully, if you know the Al Nisim prayer that talks about this, right? The Al Nisim prayer doesn't mention the lighting of the candles, right? It says that they won the war. That's the big miracle. But it says something beautiful about it, the prayer. Talking to God, we say, Ravta rivam, danta dinam, nakamta nikmatam. You fought their fight. You avenged their vengeance. Shouldn't we say the opposite? I mean, who were they fighting for? Were they not fighting for God? Was it not His war that they were fighting? No. It was completely the opposite. They were fighting for themselves. They were fighting for their identity. They were fighting for their family that was under threat of being completely lost. They were fighting for their place in the world. And the beauty of it is that HaKadosh Baruch Hu came in because of that covenant, because He has committed to it, because He promised He would. And He carried it out with them. And so when we speak to HaKadosh Baruch Hu on Hanukkah, we say, you fought our fight. You waged our war. And you showed us that you were committed to us. And that's the nature of Hanukkah, which is why there's this amazing, amazing law that is absolutely singular in all of the halachic corpus. And with that I will end, because I'm conscious of time. And even though I asked Rabbi Fine to go and make the source sheets, and he went and ran and made the source sheets, and I haven't read one source on the source sheets, I'm going to do one just so that you didn't do Pe'ula Lechinam. So take a look at this, although I suggest you peruse the source sheets, because there's interesting things there. Oh, but I only have here we are. So take a look. It's on page 3 out of 4, and it's at the bottom here. Yeah, it's on the last page. The most unique halakha in the corpus of all of halakha, nothing like it. And you might know this, of course, but nonetheless, let's read it together. And it says in Masechet Shabbat, Tanu Rabbanan, Mitzvat Hanukkah ner ish ubeto. You know how the mitzvah of the ner of Hanukkah manifests? It manifests by man and his household. I understand I'm talking to a room full of female students, and so don't ask me why to say man and his household. It's just how it was at the time. It was head of household. But the real halakha is that as far as men and women are concerned, with regards to ner Hanukkah, they are absolutely equal in it. There is no differentiation whatsoever in terms of the obligation and the entirety of the mitzvah. So what this says is that ner Hanukkah is a familial mitzvah. That's what it means, the bayit. It is a familial mitzvah, which means that the family needs to execute the commandment or execute the mitzvah. What does that mean practically? That means that for example, I'm not going back to London until Sunday night, which is the first night of Hanukkah, which means that I will not be in a place that is conducive to lighting the Nerot Hanukkah, unfortunately, on the first night. So what will I do? How do I fulfill the mitzvah? The way that I fulfill mitzvah is I ask my kids who are at home in London, light the Nerot Hanukkah. They're over the age of mitzvot. Light the Nerot Hanukkah. And if I do not see a light the entire night and day, have fulfilled the mitzvah. Why? Because my household has lit. And that is the mitzvah. There are very interesting halachot that surround this, right? Because then where do you define the household? What if the parents are both away and the kids are the only ones home? Are they the household or the parents the household? Where does it go? Is it mobile? Does it go with the heads of household? And so on and so forth. But this is a unique mitzvah. The Hachamim established And this is how I'd like to read it. I'm suggesting, you don't have to take it, you could toss it, but I'm suggesting nonetheless, that the Hachamim established Nerot Hanukkah because this war that we fought was a fight for our family. When for the first time in history, we genuinely recognized that there was a threat that the entire family with whom God entered into covenant, started with Avraham Avinu, was in danger of genuinely dissipating and disappearing into something completely different and lost. It was touch and go. And we felt something internally, even if it was a small part of us, and we rebelled and fought and won that war, and the Hachamim said, we have retained our family intact, and therefore the Ner Hanukkah, the light that we light, which minimally is one, is to be lit for the family, and that it is to stand for the family, because it's the family that won this war. And so that means that wherever you are, as long as your family is lighting, you fulfill your obligation. And if you are the one at home and you're lighting, you do it for your entire family and it runs. That's what Ner Ish Ubeto means. There's no halacha like this anywhere else. It manifests some very interesting halachic questions, but nonetheless, that's what it is. And so it is important to think of that, because wherever you are, you know that there is this intangible bond that runs between you and the rest of your family. Regardless of how well your relationships are going with those particular family members, it's irrelevant. There is a familial bond that holds you all together. Because it may very well be that you don't particularly like everyone in your family. You may like to hang out with other people more. But you know that if they needed you, you would probably be on the first train, plane, car, back to wherever it was that they were, and you'd be there and do what it is that they needed from you. There's a very big difference between like and familial bond. And it is something that we take for granted, that it will always be there. We take for granted in our own families, and we take it for granted in our broader national family that is us. So I only present this to you to be able to offer in a perspective that in this Hanukkah, it is important for us to consider, number one, to be aware of the fact of family, that it is important, even if the relationships are not the best that they can be, that there is a reality of relationship that you have with certain people on this earth that are yours, and the broader connection to the national family that we are as Jewish people. And what that means is that whether you are like in mind in ideology, in philosophy, in religious practice, well, those are wonderful conversations to have with other members of the family. But no matter what, if they know nothing more, they are members of your family. I will look with you, if I can, at one source, right, very quickly, but I know that because we have to end it. Is it fast? All right, so let's look at one source just to look at this, right? Because to understand how this manifests halachically is important, right? That it isn't at the core ideology. So you know this law. You know the law that, if we were to talk about marriage, for example, yeah? That as long as a person is Jewish, part of the family, one way or another, that's the only question that we ask when they want to marry into the family. Right? So if we have somebody who is Jewish, they want to get married, go to the rabbi. The rabbi's interested in one major thing. Are they Jewish? As far as a halachic marriage is concerned. That's it. Right? So they can be Jewish one of two ways. What are they? Yeah? They're either their mother's Jewish or they converted. And conversion simply means that they have now become part of the family. There are more than one way to become part of a family. You can marry into a family, you can be born into a family. So converts come into the family that way. Interestingly, according to Jewish law, their relationships with their prior family dissolve. And they become completely part of the Jewish family. So that's how you do it. And that is the only question that's asked. And that means, halachically, if two Jewish people, let's say they know nothing about Judaism, zero. They woke up yesterday and found out that their mother was Jewish. They lived their entire... I know people like this. I actually have two people converting in my Beit Din that really recently just found out that they were Jewish, had no clue whatsoever that they were Jewish. only found out later in their life, in their 20s, their mother told them, yeah, actually I'm Jewish, and your grandmother was Jewish, and we didn't tell anybody because we came out of the war, and we decided we better not tell anybody we're Jewish, and we raised you as though no connection to anything whatsoever. So all of a sudden they know. So he wakes up yesterday and finds out that he's Jewish. Is he allowed to marry another Jewish person? Absolutely. If he went and married a Jewish person without the rabbi, 2 witnesses, and did it right, said, Harat Mekudeshli, gave the ring, and there were 2 kosher witnesses that saw it, they need a get. That's all that we look at. We don't ask, well, how much about Judaism do you know? And likewise, we had a non-Jew who knew everything about, taught Judaism in university, right? Had great knowledge of the Talmud. And they wanted to marry. You have to become part of the family. That's how it runs. And that's something that one should never forget. So no matter how strong the ideological differences are, which are fine and important, they have to be discussed. At the core, we are brothers and sisters. And that is highlighted on Hanukkah in the Ner Yishu Beto aspect of the mitzvah. So I just offer that to you. If there are any questions, we have time for questions, I don't know, but you'll tell me. You let me know. Okay, so we'll have 3 questions and I'll have 30-second answers and we'll overcome it. If there are any. If there's not, that's fine, we can end. Are there any questions on it? No? Good. Yes?
It's not about the shiur, but it's about like
general
life, yeah?
Oh, my life, yes, okay.
Does the Rabbi experience when dealing with non-Jews having that separation between himself and non-Jews, knowing that they're not part of the family, but you're still interacting with them? And
yeah, it's actually in very different ways. But yes, I definitely feel that. I mean, when it comes to, like when I sit with the Archbishop of Canterbury, not that I'm name dropping, but if I sit with the Archbishop, which I did, I was sitting the other day with the Archbishop of Canterbury and we were talking about Bible, passage in the Tanakh. And I realized that for him this was an academic study and for me this was the history of my people. And that we didn't share. And it was just so evident in what it was I was talking about. I read these stories and I'm talking about my family. This is my familial history. If I go back, my great-grandparents are all part of this. And for him, it's from the outside looking in. And it just dawns on me when I'm talking with him or anyone else that way, that's how it manifests. So that's an example of how it is. But yes, I absolutely feel it. Yeah. Yeah, Chamovdia? Well, I'll tell you one story that you probably won't hear. And that is that she's asking me about Rabbi Ovadia Yosef, right? He's my wife's grandfather. And I spent many, many years with him and a lot of time with him. And I can tell you probably a story that you won't hear, and that is that he used to love to make pickles. And he would make them for Shabbat, like he would make them for a big, huge thing of pickles. And he would sit at the table and he would give them to all of the grandkids. He'd have all the grandkids come around and he'd give them and he would say, Maaseh Yadai. He would say, it's the work of my hands, the pickles. And he loved Arabic music, loved it, and he was an expert in the songs. He knew every song, and he loved singing. And he would sit for hours at the table singing if he had the opportunity to. Everybody thought, and he did. I mean, he learned insane amounts and insane hours. But if he had an opportunity to sit and sing, Pizmonim and things like that, he would, and he loved it. So I'll give you those things, right? Because those are things you will never hear about him, nor will they ever say. It's not in the Art Scroll version. They're not going to put that in. So I tell you those things. That's something that I think was beautiful about him. He was very human. Very human. Okay. I don't want to press my time, but I very much appreciate your time and your presence and for sharing with me. And Professor Perelis and Rabbi Fine, thank you for your inviting me, and please God, we'll do it again. Hanukkah Sameach.